When you think of Rome's most notorious emperors, names like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus probably come to mind. But there was one person who wielded more power than any of them, who orchestrated murders that would make Machiavelli blush, and who ultimately brought about the downfall of the very dynasty she fought so hard to control. Her name was Agrippina the Younger, and she was arguably the most dangerous woman in human history. This isn't just another story about Roman excess or imperial corruption. This is the tale of a woman who murdered her way to the throne, manipulated emperors like chess pieces, and created a monster so terrible that even she couldn't control him. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, ambition, and the price of absolute control. The story of Agrippina doesn't just reveal the dark heart of imperial Rome, it exposes uncomfortable truths about how far someone will go when they believe their destiny justifies any atrocity. By the end of this video, you'll understand why ancient historians considered her more terrifying than any emperor, and why her legacy still haunts us today. But be warned, this story contains details so disturbing that they were censored by Roman historians who had witnessed gladiatorial games and public crucifixions. The woman you're about to meet makes modern political scandals look like children's games, and her methods were so ruthless that they shocked an empire built on conquest and slavery. To understand how Agrippina became history's most dangerous woman, we need to go back to her childhood, because monsters aren't born, they're made. And the Roman imperial family was a perfect factory for creating human monsters. Agrippina the Younger was born in 15 AD into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the most powerful family in the known world. Her father was Germanicus, a beloved Roman general who was essentially the people's choice to become emperor. Her mother was Agrippina the Elder, a woman known for her fierce loyalty and political intelligence. On paper, this should have been the perfect imperial childhood. But here's what the history books often gloss over: growing up in the Roman imperial family wasn't a privilege, it was a survival course where failure meant death. From her earliest memories, young Agrippina watched as family members disappeared in the night, victims of palace intrigue and imperial paranoia. Her grandfather, the famous Augustus, had created a system where the emperor's family lived in constant fear of each other, where brothers murdered brothers and mothers poisoned sons to secure succession. When Agrippina was just 4 years old, her beloved father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. Official sources claimed illness, but everyone knew the truth: he had been poisoned. The prime suspect? Emperor Tiberius, her own great-uncle, who saw Germanicus as a threat to his power. Imagine being 4 years old and learning that your family will kill you if you become inconvenient. That lesson would shape everything Agrippina did for the rest of her life. But the real education in survival began when Agrippina was 8. Her mother, Agrippina the Elder, was arrested on charges of treason, charges that were almost certainly fabricated by Tiberius. The woman who had been Rome's most beloved matron was exiled to a barren island where she was slowly starved to death. Young Agrippina watched her mother's destruction and learned 2 crucial lessons that would define her entire approach to power. First, that being loved by the people meant nothing if you didn't control the emperor, and second, that in the imperial family, you either killed or were killed, there was no middle ground. The girl who had once played in the gardens of the imperial palace now understood that her survival depended on becoming more ruthless than anyone around her. And she proved to be an exceptional student. Agrippina's teenage years were spent in the court of Caligula, her brother, after he became emperor in 37 AD. Now, Caligula is remembered as one of history's most deranged rulers, but what's often overlooked is how his sisters, particularly Agrippina, influenced his descent into madness. Historical sources suggest that Agrippina and her sisters engaged in an incestuous relationship with Caligula, but this wasn't just about twisted family dynamics. For Agrippina, seducing her brother was a calculated political move, a way to maintain her position at the center of power. But Caligula was unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous for someone in Agrippina's position. When the emperor began showing signs of paranoia about his sister's influence, Agrippina made her first major political miscalculation: she got involved in a conspiracy against him. In 39 AD, Caligula discovered the plot and had Agrippina exiled, just as her mother had been. But unlike her mother, Agrippina had learned to play the long game. During her exile, she didn't despair, she planned. For 2 years, Agrippina lived on a small island, but she used this time to develop the network of contacts and the strategic thinking that would eventually make her the most powerful woman in Rome. She studied every move that had led to her mother's destruction and vowed never to repeat those mistakes. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, Agrippina's uncle Claudius became emperor. Claudius recalled her from exile, probably thinking he was showing mercy to a chastened young woman. He had no idea he was unleashing a carefully prepared predator back into the heart of the empire. The Agrippina who returned from exile was not the impulsive young woman who had been banished. She was now a calculated, ruthless political operative who had learned that sentiment was weakness and that the only security lay in absolute control. Her first move was marriage. Agrippina quickly married Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a wealthy and well-connected senator. This wasn't a love match, it was a strategic alliance designed to give her resources and legitimacy. In 37 AD, she gave birth to a son who would eventually become known to history as Nero. From the moment of Nero's birth, Agrippina began planning his path to the throne. She didn't see her infant son as a beloved child to be protected, she saw him as her ticket to ultimate power. And she was willing to do absolutely anything to secure that future. But Agrippina's ambitions went far beyond simply positioning her son for succession. She wanted something that no Roman woman had ever achieved. She wanted to rule the empire herself, using her son as a front. This wasn't just about family advancement, this was about personal power on a scale that would have terrified Augustus himself. The stage was now set for one of history's most sophisticated and brutal political campaigns. Agrippina had learned every lesson that imperial politics could teach, and she was about to put that education to use in ways that would shock even hardened Roman politicians. By 48 AD, Agrippina had positioned herself as one of the most influential women in Rome, but she wanted more. She wanted ultimate power, and there was only one way to get it: she needed to marry the emperor himself. The problem was that Emperor Claudius was already married to Messalina, one of the most notoriously promiscuous women in Roman history. Messalina was famous for her sexual excesses, but she was also politically cunning and wasn't about to give up her position without a fight. But Agrippina had learned patience during her exile, and she knew that everyone in Rome, even emperors, eventually made fatal mistakes. She just had to wait for Messalina to overplay her hand. That opportunity came when Messalina made perhaps the most spectacularly stupid decision in Roman imperial history. While Claudius was away from Rome, she actually went through a marriage ceremony with her lover, Gaius Silius. Technically, this made her guilty of treason, adultery, and bigamy all at once. When news of this reached Claudius, even his legendary indecisiveness couldn't protect Messalina. She was executed, and suddenly the most powerful position in the Roman world, wife of the emperor, was vacant. Pause for dramatic effect. Now, here's where Agrippina's true genius revealed itself. Any other ambitious woman would have immediately begun campaigning to become Claudius's next wife. But Agrippina understood that direct ambition would be seen as threatening. Instead, she played a much more sophisticated game. First, she positioned herself as Claudius's grieving niece, offering comfort and support during his difficult time. She presented herself not as a potential wife, but as a loyal family member who only wanted to help her uncle navigate his personal crisis. But while playing the role of supportive niece, Agrippina was actually conducting one of history's most brilliant seduction campaigns. She studied Claudius's every weakness, every insecurity, every desire, and then crafted herself into exactly what he needed. Claudius was a scholarly man who had always been mocked by other members of the imperial family for his stutter and his perceived weakness. Agrippina made him feel like the powerful, respected emperor he had always wanted to be. She listened to his historical lectures with rapt attention, praised his intelligence, and made him believe that she saw the greatness that others had missed. But this wasn't just about emotional manipulation. Agrippina also made herself indispensable to Claudius's political survival. She used her extensive network of contacts to provide him with intelligence about potential conspiracies and rival claimants to the throne. She became his most trusted advisor, the one person he believed he could rely on completely. The seduction took months, but it was methodical and ruthless. Agrippina calculated exactly how long to maintain the pretense of being just a helpful niece before allowing Claudius to realize that he had fallen in love with her. She timed every gesture, every conversation, every moment of vulnerability to maximum effect. When Claudius finally proposed marriage in 49 AD, he genuinely believed it had been his idea. He had no concept of how completely he had been manipulated by a master strategist who had been planning this moment for years. But there was one major problem with Agrippina's plan: Roman law forbade marriage between uncles and nieces. For anyone else, this would have been an insurmountable obstacle. For Agrippina, it was just another challenge to overcome. She convinced Claudius that the law should be changed, not just for their personal benefit, but for the good of the empire. She argued that allowing the emperor to marry within his own family would strengthen the dynasty and prevent the kind of succession crises that had plagued Rome in the past. Music becomes more triumphant but with dark undertones. The Senate, terrified of opposing the emperor's wishes, quickly passed the necessary legislation. On January 1, 49 AD, Agrippina became Empress of Rome, achieving a level of power that no Roman woman had ever held before. But for Agrippina, marriage to Claudius wasn't the end goal, it was just the beginning. She had married the emperor not because she loved him, but because she needed him to adopt her son Nero and make him heir to the throne. This is where Agrippina's manipulation became truly masterful. She couldn't simply demand that Claudius adopt Nero, that would reveal her true motivations too clearly. Instead, she had to make Claudius believe that adopting Nero was his own brilliant idea for securing the imperial succession. She began by subtly undermining confidence in Britannicus, Claudius's biological son with Messalina. Not through direct criticism, that would have been too obvious, but through carefully planted suggestions about the boy's character and abilities. At the same time, she showcased Nero's intelligence, charm, and political potential at every opportunity. She arranged for Nero to give speeches that highlighted his oratorical skills, organized philosophical discussions that demonstrated his intellectual depth, and made sure that Claudius saw her son as the obvious choice for Rome's future leader. The campaign to secure Nero's adoption took over a year, but Agrippina's patience and strategic thinking paid off. In 50 AD, Claudius officially adopted Nero and designated him as his primary heir, bypassing his own biological son. With this adoption, Agrippina had achieved something unprecedented. She had maneuvered her son into position to become emperor of Rome, making herself the effective power behind the throne. But she wasn't satisfied with being the power behind the throne, she wanted to be the power on the throne. What Claudius didn't realize was that by adopting Nero, he had signed his own death warrant. Agrippina now had everything she needed from her husband, and keeping him alive had become more of a liability than an asset. You see, Claudius was starting to have second thoughts about the adoption. Historical sources suggest that he was beginning to regret bypassing Britannicus and was considering changing his mind about the succession. For Agrippina, this was an existential threat that had to be eliminated immediately. But killing an emperor required careful planning. It couldn't look like murder that would destroy everything she had worked for. It had to appear natural, inevitable, perhaps even merciful given Claudius's advanced age and declining health. Agrippina began her final campaign against Claudius with characteristic patience and precision. She studied his habits, his favorite foods, his daily routines, looking for the perfect opportunity to eliminate him without raising suspicion. The method she chose was both elegant and horrifying in its simplicity: poison. But not just any poison. Agrippina selected a toxin that would mimic the symptoms of a natural illness, allowing her to murder her husband while maintaining plausible deniability. The assassination of Emperor Claudius in 54 AD stands as one of history's most perfectly executed murders, so perfect that historians debate to this day whether it actually happened, despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence that points directly to Agrippina. What made this murder so sophisticated wasn't just the method, but the psychological preparation that Agrippina had been conducting for months. She had spent the entire year of 54 AD systematically isolating Claudius from anyone who might protect him, while simultaneously positioning herself as his most loving and devoted caregiver. The key to Agrippina's plan was a woman named Locusta, who was Rome's most skilled poisoner. Locusta wasn't just some back-alley criminal, she was an artist of death, someone who understood the science of toxins with the precision of a modern pharmacologist. But here's what makes Agrippina's choice of Locusta so chilling: she didn't just want Claudius dead, she wanted him to die in a way that would serve her political purposes. A sudden death might raise suspicions, but a lingering illness would give her time to consolidate power and ensure Nero's smooth succession. The poison that Locusta prepared was a masterpiece of biochemical warfare. It was designed to mimic the symptoms of a stomach ailment, something that would seem entirely natural for a man of Claudius's age and lifestyle. The toxin would work slowly, giving Agrippina days or even weeks to prepare for the transition of power. But Agrippina's genius wasn't just in choosing the right poison, it was in choosing the perfect delivery method. She knew that Claudius had a weakness for mushrooms, particularly a rare variety called Caesar's mushrooms that were considered a delicacy among the Roman elite. On the night of October 12, 54 AD, Agrippina personally prepared a special dinner for her husband, featuring his favorite mushroom dish. She cooked it herself, something she rarely did, claiming that she wanted to show her love and devotion through this personal gesture. Contemporary accounts describe Claudius as being particularly happy that evening, touched by his wife's attention and enjoying what he believed was a romantic dinner with the woman he loved. He had no idea that every bite was bringing him closer to death. The poison worked exactly as intended. Within hours, Claudius began experiencing what appeared to be severe food poisoning. But instead of calling for Rome's best physicians, Agrippina insisted on caring for her husband personally, claiming that she didn't want to alarm the public by suggesting the emperor was seriously ill. For 3 days, Agrippina maintained this pretense, nursing Claudius while actually ensuring that he received no effective medical treatment. She controlled who could see him, what medicines he received, and how information about his condition was communicated to the outside world. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Historical sources suggest that Claudius might have survived the initial poisoning, his constitution was stronger than Agrippina had anticipated. When it became clear that he was beginning to recover, she made a decision that reveals the true depths of her ruthlessness. Agrippina called in a physician named Xenophon, who was secretly in her employ. Under the pretense of helping Claudius vomit up the poison, Xenophon used a feather that had been dipped in a second, more potent toxin. The treatment that was supposed to save the emperor's life actually delivered the final, fatal dose. Claudius died on October 13, 54 AD, apparently from natural causes related to his stomach ailment. The official cause of death was listed as food poisoning from bad mushrooms, an explanation that everyone accepted because it seemed so plausible. But Agrippina's perfect murder was just the beginning of her masterpiece. She had spent months preparing for this moment, and her response to Claudius's death was a work of political theater that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. First, she maintained absolute secrecy about the emperor's death for several hours, using this time to ensure that all key military commanders and government officials were loyal to Nero. She sent trusted agents to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and to eliminate any potential threats to her son's succession. When she finally announced Claudius's death, it was accompanied by the immediate proclamation of Nero as emperor. There was no time for rivals to organize opposition, no opportunity for the Senate to debate alternatives. By the time most Romans learned that Claudius was dead, Nero was already securely established on the throne. At age 45, Agrippina had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history. She had successfully murdered an emperor and installed her own son as his replacement. But more than that, she had positioned herself as the real power behind the throne, the person who would actually rule the Roman Empire through her teenage son. The morning after Nero's accession, Agrippina appeared in public wearing the robes and symbols of imperial authority, making it clear that she intended to be a co-ruler rather than simply the emperor's mother. She had achieved what no Roman woman before her had even attempted: effective control of the entire known world. But there was one problem with Agrippina's perfect plan: she had underestimated her own son. Nero was not the pliable puppet she had expected him to be. He was intelligent, ambitious, and had inherited more of his mother's ruthlessness than she had anticipated. The woman who had spent years planning to control an emperor was about to discover that creating a monster is much easier than controlling one. When 16-year-old Nero became emperor of Rome in 54 AD, Agrippina believed she had finally achieved her ultimate goal, absolute power exercised through a son who would be completely dependent on her guidance and support. She had spent years grooming him for this moment, teaching him to see her not just as his mother, but as his essential partner in ruling the empire. But Agrippina had made a crucial miscalculation. She had been so focused on making Nero emperor that she had failed to consider what would happen when he actually gained power. The boy she thought she could control had been watching and learning from her manipulations, and he had absorbed lessons she never intended to teach. From the very first days of his reign, Nero began displaying an independence that alarmed his mother. Instead of consulting her on every decision, he started making choices without her input. Instead of presenting them as co-rulers, he relegated her to the traditional role of emperor's mother. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, this was a calculated power play by someone who had learned political manipulation from a master. Nero understood that as long as Agrippina remained influential, people would see him as her puppet rather than a legitimate emperor in his own right. The first major conflict between mother and son came over Nero's choice of advisors. Agrippina had expected to be his primary counselor, but Nero instead turned to his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. These men had their own agenda for the empire, and they understood that diminishing Agrippina's influence was essential to their own power. What followed was a sophisticated campaign by Seneca and Burrus to drive a wedge between Nero and his mother. They didn't directly criticize Agrippina, that would have been too dangerous. Instead, they subtly suggested that Nero's greatness was being overshadowed by his mother's reputation, that he would never be seen as a true emperor as long as he appeared to be under her control. For someone as prideful and ambitious as Nero, these suggestions were perfectly calculated poison. He began to see his mother not as his greatest asset, but as the primary obstacle to his own glory and independence. Agrippina, meanwhile, was struggling to adapt to her changing circumstances. For years, she had been the one manipulating others, but now she found herself being outmaneuvered by her own son and his advisors. Her attempts to reassert control only pushed Nero further away and made her appear increasingly desperate. The breaking point came in 55 AD, when Agrippina attempted to use her traditional method of influence, seduction and manipulation. She began making public appearances that emphasized her importance to the regime, and she reportedly attempted to use physical intimacy to regain her hold over her son. Historical sources suggest that Agrippina actually attempted to seduce Nero, her own son, as a way of regaining political control. This wasn't about maternal affection or even twisted family dynamics. This was a calculated political move by a woman who saw incest as just another tool for maintaining power. But Nero was no longer the malleable boy she had raised. He was now a young man who had learned to see relationships purely in terms of power and advantage. When his mother attempted to manipulate him through intimacy, he recognized it as a threat to his authority that had to be eliminated. The psychological dynamic between Agrippina and Nero during this period was extraordinarily complex and disturbing. She had created him to be her instrument of power, but in doing so, she had taught him to see human relationships as transactions and people as expendable resources. Now those lessons were being turned against her. Nero's first move against his mother was to strip her of her official honors and remove her from the imperial palace. In 55 AD, he forced her to move to a separate residence and eliminated her bodyguard, effectively placing her under house arrest. But this wasn't enough for Nero. He had learned from Agrippina's own methods that half measures were dangerous. Enemies who were merely defeated could recover and return stronger. The lesson she had taught him through her treatment of Claudius was that permanent solutions required permanent elimination. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina during 56 and 57 AD was a deadly chess match between two masters of manipulation. Agrippina attempted to rebuild her power base by cultivating relationships with senators and military commanders who might support her against her son. Nero, meanwhile, worked to isolate her completely while preparing for her eventual elimination. What made this conflict particularly chilling was how both mother and son approached it with cold, calculated logic rather than emotional heat. This wasn't a family feud, this was a political war between two sociopaths who happened to be related. Agrippina's attempts to regain influence became increasingly desperate and dangerous. She began making veiled threats about revealing Nero's illegitimate claim to the throne, suggesting that she could expose how she had manipulated Claudius's adoption. She even hinted that she might support Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, as a rival claimant. These threats were exactly what Nero had been waiting for. They gave him justification for treating his mother not as family, but as an enemy of the state who threatened the stability of his reign. In 55 AD, Nero made his first move in what would become a campaign of systematic elimination. Britannicus, the last potential rival to his throne, died suddenly at a dinner party, officially from natural causes, but almost certainly from poison provided by the same Locusta who had killed Claudius. The message to Agrippina was clear: if Nero could eliminate his adoptive brother without consequences, he could eliminate anyone who threatened his power, including his own mother. But Agrippina was not easily intimidated. She had survived the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius through a combination of cunning and ruthlessness, and she believed she could outlast and outmaneuver her son just as she had outmaneuvered every other rival she had faced. This confidence would prove to be her final, fatal mistake. By 59 AD, the relationship between Nero and his mother Agrippina had deteriorated into open warfare. Both understood that their conflict could only end with the death of one or the other, and both were preparing for that final confrontation with characteristic ruthlessness. But Nero faced a unique challenge in eliminating his mother. Unlike his previous victims, Agrippina was not just a political rival, she was the woman who had made him emperor. Killing her would require not just careful planning, but a level of sophistication that would make the murder appear justified, even necessary for the good of the empire. The method Nero chose for his mother's assassination was so elaborate and theatrical that it reads like something from a Hollywood thriller rather than ancient history. It was a plan that combined multiple assassination attempts, psychological warfare, and political theater in ways that would have impressed even Agrippina herself. The first attempt on Agrippina's life was almost comic in its complexity. Nero commissioned the construction of a special ship designed to collapse and sink, drowning his mother while making her death appear accidental. The vessel was built with a collapsible ceiling that could be triggered remotely, and a false bottom that would cause the ship to sink rapidly once activated. In early 59 AD, Nero invited his mother to join him for a reconciliation celebration at his villa in Baiae, on the Bay of Naples. He presented this as an opportunity for them to repair their relationship and work together for the good of the empire. Agrippina, despite her suspicions, agreed to attend, perhaps because she still believed she could regain control over her son. After a pleasant evening of dining and conversation, Nero insisted that his mother return to her own villa by sea, offering her the use of his special ship as a gesture of honor and affection. As Agrippina boarded the vessel, she may have suspected a trap, but she couldn't have imagined the elaborate death machine her son had prepared for her. The assassination attempt began as the ship reached deeper waters. On Nero's signal, the ceiling of the cabin was supposed to collapse, crushing Agrippina instantly. But the mechanism malfunctioned, and while the ceiling did fall, it didn't kill her, it only injured her and alerted her to the danger. When the collapsing ceiling failed to eliminate Agrippina, the ship's crew activated the secondary mechanism, causing the vessel to begin sinking rapidly. But even this didn't work as planned. Agrippina was an experienced swimmer, and despite her injuries, she managed to escape from the sinking ship and swim toward shore. The woman who had survived decades of imperial politics was not going to be defeated by a malfunctioning assassination device. As she swam through the dark waters of the Bay of Naples, Agrippina must have realized that her son had finally moved against her with deadly intent. But Nero's plan had a third phase. He had stationed soldiers along the shore with orders to kill any survivors from the accident. When Agrippina reached the beach, exhausted and injured but still alive, she found herself facing armed men who had been ordered to finish what the ship had failed to accomplish. What happened next demonstrates both Agrippina's incredible survival instincts and her deep understanding of Roman political psychology. Instead of trying to flee or fight, she did something that momentarily paralyzed her would-be killers. She revealed her identity and demanded to be taken to her son. The soldiers, confronted with the spectacle of the emperor's mother emerging from the sea like some vengeful goddess, hesitated just long enough for Agrippina to press her psychological advantage, rather than killing her on the spot. For a few hours, it seemed as though Agrippina had once again outmaneuvered her enemies through sheer force of personality and political skill. But Nero was no longer the uncertain teenager who could be manipulated by his mother's theatrical performances. When he learned that Agrippina had survived his elaborate assassination attempt, he didn't panic or retreat, he simply moved to a more direct approach. On the morning after the failed ship assassination, Nero sent a small group of soldiers to Agrippina's villa with simple, direct orders: kill her by any means necessary. There would be no more elaborate schemes, no more attempts to make the murder look accidental. This was to be a straightforward execution disguised as the suppression of a dangerous conspiracy. When the soldiers arrived at her villa, Agrippina knew immediately why they had come. But even facing certain death, she refused to show fear or beg for mercy. According to historical accounts, when the centurion raised his sword to strike her down, Agrippina's final words were both defiant and prophetic: "Strike my womb, for it bore Nero." With those words, Agrippina acknowledged both her greatest achievement and her greatest mistake. She had created the monster who was now destroying her, and she faced her death with the same cold calculation that had defined her entire approach to power. Agrippina died on March 23, 59 AD, at the age of 44. Her death marked the end of one of history's most sophisticated and ruthless political careers, but it also marked the beginning of Nero's transformation from a merely ambitious emperor into one of history's most notorious tyrants. The immediate aftermath of Agrippina's assassination revealed the full extent of Nero's political sophistication. Instead of simply announcing her death, he launched a comprehensive propaganda campaign designed to justify the murder and consolidate his power. Nero claimed that his mother had been plotting against him, that she had been discovered in treasonous correspondence with his enemies, and that her death was necessary to preserve the stability of the empire. He produced evidence of her conspiracy, documents that were almost certainly forged, and presented himself as a reluctant son who had been forced to choose between family loyalty and duty to Rome. The Roman public, exhausted by decades of imperial family drama, largely accepted this explanation. They had witnessed the destructive conflicts between Tiberius and his family, between Caligula and his sisters, between Claudius and Messalina. The idea that another imperial family member had turned traitor seemed entirely plausible. But while Nero had successfully eliminated his mother and consolidated his power, he had also crossed a psychological threshold that would define the rest of his reign. Having killed the person who created him, he was now free to become the monster she had always intended him to be, but without any restraints on his cruelty or ambition. The death of Agrippina the Younger in 59 AD marked more than just the end of one woman's remarkable and terrible life. It marked the beginning of a new phase of imperial tyranny that would ultimately destroy the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunge Rome into civil war. In the immediate aftermath of his mother's assassination, Nero experienced what can only be described as a complete psychological liberation. The woman who had controlled and manipulated him for the first part of his reign was gone, and with her death, all the restraints on his behavior disappeared as well. Within months of Agrippina's murder, Nero began displaying the erratic and cruel behavior that would make him one of history's most notorious tyrants. He divorced his wife Octavia and had her executed on fabricated charges of adultery. He began indulging in increasingly bizarre public performances, forcing senators to watch him sing and act in theatrical productions. He launched construction projects of such massive scale that they bankrupted the imperial treasury. But most significantly, Nero began employing the same methods of systematic elimination that he had learned from his mother. Anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his rule, anyone who possessed wealth that could be confiscated, anyone who represented a potential threat to his power, all were marked for death or exile. The techniques that Agrippina had perfected, the use of poison, the manipulation of legal proceedings, the creation of false evidence, became standard tools of Nero's government. The woman who had murdered her way to power had created a system of institutionalized assassination that would outlive her by decades. Perhaps most chilling of all, Nero seemed to take genuine pleasure in the suffering of others in ways that even Agrippina had not. While she had killed and manipulated for political advantage, Agrippina's name may not be as widely known as Nero or Caligula. But make no mistake, she made them. She shaped them. She unleashed them. And in doing so, she didn't just destroy emperors. She helped destroy the very soul of imperial Rome. Her life is a brutal reminder that unchecked ambition, even when cloaked in maternal devotion or imperial duty, can corrupt more thoroughly than any sword or senate decree. She was a daughter of power, a maker of emperors, and ultimately a victim of the very monster she created. And yet, across centuries, across ruins and dusty manuscripts, Agrippina still haunts the history of Rome. She didn't just live in an age of monsters. She taught them how to rule. If you've stayed with us until now, you know this isn't just a story about ancient Rome. It's a story about power, legacy, and the cost of control. If you want more stories like this, dark, true, and unforgettable, subscribe. Because the past didn't stay buried. And neither will the truth. Subscribe to Soul of the Century. And let history disturb you, enlighten you, and haunt you.